Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 10, the Global Trade War episode. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this special episode, we are looking back 5 years to the launch of your book, Steve's book, the classic, retail classic, Remarkable Retail bestseller, and both celebrating and revisiting, updating, discussing the book and its subsequent COVID second edition, the hits, the misses, the lessons learned, maybe the lessons missed by the retail industry, and placing the frame, though, solidly in the context of today and tomorrow for what merchants need to do to survive and thrive in 2025. Steve, we've been teasing it for the past couple of episodes that you and I heading to the Big Apple, spreading the news in New York City. Tell the people what's going on in our big news.
Well, we are going to be the official podcast of the Commerce Next Growth Show. Which will include a bunch of cool things, some of which we'll be telling you about a little bit further down the road. But one thing in particular is we will be hosting their award ceremony the first night of the show. And we will be recording a number of episodes with their many, many excellent speakers. And that'll comprise the bulk of our summer season. So that will be fun. So people should get out there and register right now. We'll wait. And we have a code so you can save some money on your registration, which we will put in the show notes.
And just if I could add my encouragement, the Commerce Next Growth Show is one of the best shows of its kind. So if you by chance don't know of it, be sure and check it out. And the team that puts it together, I've been working with off and on and known for many, many years. So it is top quality. And of course, we're thrilled to be partnering with them. So very exciting news all the way around. All right. Yippee ki-yay. Let's get into the news.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, where do we start? It's another busy week of kind of stops and starts and just a big, as a comic in all seriousness, a huge war between China and America over tariffs. Take us through kind of the week from your perspective real quickly, but then let's just get into what this all means as we understand it today, this week for retail.
Well, again, people who have been listening the last few weeks know that I have a standard disclaimer, which is, number one, things are changing so quickly that we don't know what will be true by the time you listen to this, whether it's the day the episode comes out, or, of course, many people listen several days down the road or a week down the road. So be careful not to spend too much time on precise news and expect that that's going to hold. And the other thing is there are plenty of other podcasts that do deep dives on these sort of issues. So this is not an attempt to do political analysis or deep dive on the economics. But I thought we just kind of do what, so what, now what, and a little bit of maybe some things that perhaps people aren't paying enough attention to. So the what, as most people will know, is Trump folded essentially a 90-day pause on many of the tariffs, but not all. And that led to most countries standing down with some of their retaliatory measures, but definitely not China. I think perhaps by the time you listen to it, we'll be at 1,000,000% or 1,000,000,000%, because it just has gotten to the point where it almost doesn't matter what the number is. But, one thing that I think people maybe didn't really appreciate is how scary a moment we got close to. I generally am a pretty good sleeper, but the night before Trump backed down, I had some insomnia, and I made the mistake of turning on Bloomberg at like 2 a.m, where basically the story was the bond market may be about to collapse. And without getting into the technicalities of that, that would be a very, very bad thing. And as much as the stock market gets all the attention, it's actually the bond market to pay more attention to for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is that, people have to finance their operations. And if there isn't liquidity and interest rates go much higher, that is a huge, huge problem. So I think it's the frailties in the bond market that actually caused Trump to blink. But regardless, now we are at a point where we are on a pause. We have continued to see long-term interest rates tick up. They were coming down just a week ago, not to get too much into the weeds on this. The 10-year bond, which is really the most important to kind of pay attention to overall economic health, had gotten down below 4%. People were very excited, but then it started and has continued to go in the other direction. So that really just speaks to a lot of concerns about inflation and continued volatility. The one piece of good news, I guess, in all this is that energy prices are down a lot. They're down because of fears of recession and some specific actions that the Saudis took. But I guess there's a little bit of a benefit. Specific to retail, though, we've continued to see retail stocks get hit quite hard. Definitely the companies like Nike, RH, Wayfair, Lululemon, and a lot of the apparel players that have exposure to production in China in particular, but Vietnam and other markets. I mean, many of those stocks are down 25%. So we'll continue to watch that. So just some quick commentary, though, on I think what maybe gets a little bit misunderstood, though I think this has been creeping back up into the narrative in the last day or so, which is that even though the tariffs, many of the tariffs were paused, there are still plenty of incremental tariffs that are in place. In fact, the so-called pause or capitulation, whatever you want to call it, basically gets us back to where we were a few days after Liberation Day. So just to give some dimension to that, the 10% tariff rate, which is pretty much across the board now, is 4 times the average tariff rate that existed previously. So that's quite significant. And obviously the whole Chinese thing is, another thing. So that's one thing just to keep in mind. And I think part of the reason why we saw the stock market go up really quickly after the announcement, but then come back down was people were like, well, wait a minute, this is not really the
this
pause
isn't the good news you thought it was.
Yeah, it's not quite as much good news. Anyway, I also think there's just more realization, as we talked about last week, is there's no 3D chess here. There's no plan. Trump is who he is, and he's just operating the way he is, which is very chaotically and from a weird just view of how tariffs are supposed to work. So I think that reality is setting in more. The other one I just wanted to mention really quickly, or maybe 2 other things quickly. One is I've seen a lot of posts where people get the tariff math wrong. In other words, they say, oh, well, if there's a 20% tariff, that means consumer prices are going to go up something like 20%. And without getting, which is hard when you're listening to something, but the tariff is in most cases applied to the cost of goods sold. So just a really quick example. If a Nike shoe sells for $100, but it costs Nike $15 to make it, the tariff is applied on that $15. So let's say it's a 20% tariff, just to use an easy number. That raises their cost of goods by $3. If that just gets passed through all the way, that's not nearly the percentage increase. Now, there's a lot of things that can happen. Is Nike going to try to maintain its standard markup? Is Dick's Sporting Goods, who buys it, going to try to maintain their standard markup? Then more of it does get multiplied through the supply chain. But of course, there are competitive dynamics. There's consumer appetite. So I think generally we have to expect consumers are not going to tolerate 20, 30, 40% increases on many products. So that will keep it down. And, Nike may be able to get some concessions from some of its suppliers. So there's a lot of things. But in general, just don't make the mistake of saying it's a 20% tariff. So that probably means the end price is going to go up 20%. It's much less than that. But still, overall, quite inflationary. Let's just get a little bit to the so what and now what. I mean, I think the so what, the risk of stating the obvious, is we haven't seen much change at this point in uncertainty and volatility. The longer that persists, the more damaging I think it is. Just as we got on the mic here, we got an updated consumer confidence report. Consumer confidence is now at the second lowest level that it's been in like 50 years. And inflation expectations continue to rise. So all of that would tend to suggest, again, I think when we talked about this a few weeks ago, there's not perfect correlation with consumer confidence and spending, but that tends to suggest that a rough road ahead. We also know from some data I saw from Bain this past week, inflation remains very much at the forefront of consumers' primary concern.
Yep.
So
affordability.
We know that, and to the degree that things slow down and inflation goes up, that doesn't suggest things. Another just quick thing is one of my predictions was that we would see deals this year, IPOs, acquisitions, et cetera. We'll talk about one in a second, but the IPO market is basically frozen. So Klarna, StubHub, a bunch of others that were planning to go public have put those plans on ice. We'll see if we see any thawing there, but that's not great. Lots of talk about supply chain disruptions. One of the things I just saw was that, basically in the next few weeks, retailers have to place their orders for Christmas decorations, holiday decor. 87% of something gets made in China. So basically nobody's ordering anything from China at the moment. So maybe you'll have to get creative with your Christmas tree. But probably still have a few more weeks before that becomes a crisis. But that just speaks to the long lead times for certain kinds of products. So things for the fall, back to school season, holiday will start to get more interesting the longer this persists. But we were talking off mic, a lot of anecdotal evidence, at least, that there's quite a bit of consumer pull forward of merchandise. Apple stores are packed. I can't remember if we mentioned this on mic, but when I bought my new car, got rid of the Tesla, got the BMW. The BMW dealership the day I tried to pick it up was just a mob scene, even though it would normally be a slow time. So, that's interesting in terms of maybe April retail sales numbers look really good.
Look good.
But then,
gonna look good.
Boom. We're not allowed to say dead cat bounce. Are we allowed to say dead cat bounce?
I was going to say, can we say dead cat bounce?
I don't know.
Let me ask you another couple of quick things, and then we'll move on to other news. There's so much news. One of the things that is lost a little bit is this ending of de minimis, which is the minimum rate by which goods can travel into America without paperwork or tariffs or taxes for specifically China, which is going right at Shein and Temu. Now, that takes place May 2nd, Workers' Day, International Workers' Day in Russia, I believe. But now they would say that
we always say this is not a history lesson, but that's a little bit of a history lesson.
There you go. Now they, being Shein and Temu, would say it's too late. Not they don't say that, but it's like our advantage doesn't simply lie in de minimis; it lies in a bunch of other things. But the paperwork alone adds a lot of friction. What do you make of that? I mean, it is a way to slow down this China factory direct model.
For sure.
Do you think it's going to slow it down?
I think it has to. I know a lot of people have said, and I had a really interesting discussion at Shop Talk with somebody about the factory direct model, saying that people really kind of misunderstand some of the economics of it and what really makes it successful, which has to do, with appropriating, shall we say, designs, testing product, and really being able to hit the market, have no leftover inventory, that kind of stuff. But if you add complexity to the system, if you add the higher shipping charges and the tariffs, I don't know exactly what that means for a $5 item, but to the extent it's 7, 8, 9, 10, it has to affect consumer demand to a degree. But I think we don't know. I think the de minimis thing is likely to stay in place. It's going to be more whatever happens with Chinese tariffs that'll probably carry things over. But when something, the other way to think about it is if something costs 80 cents to make, even a 200% tariff doesn't, again, with the math on that, doesn't necessarily completely change the way that consumers think about an item. It goes from $7 to $8. It's still so much cheaper than your alternative. Right. So, but overall, I would say it's a definite headwind. Yeah.
I'll tell you a secondary, let's call it collateral damage. There's a lot of, in Canada, there's a lot of retailers who ship to American customers. And of course, they're sourcing from China. That gets tagged too now. So I've talked to retailers here in Canada who have a big U.S. Base. And the process alone, the paperwork alone, just that's it. I can't ship it, after May 2nd. I can't ship it because the China tariffs continue because it's a China origin product. Let me end this section with one WWSD. What would Steve do? Like, you're sitting as an executive.
We're selling bumper
in
stickers
all
now with that as well.
You've been in these chairs before. I don't know if you've been in a chair like this with this level of uncertainty, but are you making buying decisions like a technology? Like, as you think about running the business, you've got objectives. Maybe you're investing in a new, an ERP or something. What do you continue? And you say, listen, this will all sort out in the long run. We'll continue doing what we do, or does this kind of calcify a lot of decision making? What would you be telling your people?
Well, I think in general, there's a bit of a wait and see attitude that I think most people have to take. What I would focus on is what stealing from our friends at McKinsey, the no regrets decisions. What are the, when you look at all these decisions, what are things that are no regrets or few regrets, and see if that helps you get a little clarity on what you can move forward to. Can you do some smaller experimenting, testing that doesn't risk too much so that you're ready to move? So I definitely think about that. The other thing I think we're going to see, which doesn't, help very much. On the one hand, and a lot of people start commenting about this is especially bad for smaller businesses, right? That don't have the access to capital. They don't have the scale.
Negotiating scale either.
Yeah, they're just they're not in the mix generally in a lot of that kind of stuff.
Takers. They're price takers. Yeah.
Right. So I think if you are in a weaker position for whatever reason, I think you have to be more conservative because the risk of getting aggressive is too far. If you're Walmart, for example, they just had their investor day here in Dallas. And one of the things that Doug McMillon talked about is they're going to use this as an opportunity to take market share. And, you can do that. It's good to be king, right? So there are a few players that have strong balance sheet, have pricing power, that can step on the gas while the 80-90% of the rest of the players are like, I don't know what to do. So, really depends on where you sit, I think. But what do you have control over? How can you create optionality in some of your decisions? How can you get ready to move as the picture hopefully becomes more clear over the next, who knows, few weeks, hopefully.
That's a good segue to talk about some of the commentary coming out of retailers around this and other things. And let's you mentioned Walmart. I saw both Phil Waba and Melissa Repko were in at that investor meeting, and they had other things to say about their forecast for the rest of the year. Let's start there. There's a few others, but let's start there.
Yeah, just real quickly. Walmart, this is interesting. They actually more or less said they were pretty confident with their revised guidance that they had given when their earnings came out a couple months back, but they pretty much said, we don't really know what's going to happen with operating income because there's just too many moving pieces. So I think that's a pattern we're seeing. JD Sports, the big European sporting goods company, they've warned that things are going to be very volatile, both because of the tariff impact, but just in general consumer confidence. Andy Jassy last week put out his annual shareholder letter, which is worth reading. He goes into a lot of things, of course, not just retail focused, but AI, AWS, et cetera, technology investments. They are basically continuing on the path of most of their major investments. They don't seem to be backing down. Another example, I think, of when you're a leader and you've got that power, you can pretty much keep going and perhaps turn this to your advantage. He said two things I thought that was interesting in his CNBC interview. One was that they haven't yet seen any major changes in consumer behavior. So now, Amazon sells a lot of less expensive stuff, right? So you wouldn't necessarily assume so much pull forward that you might see with auto dealers and Apple products and things like that. So maybe that's not too surprising. But he did say certainly they expect that prices will need to increase because some of what they're experiencing they're going to have to pass on to consumers, and they do buy a lot from China, and of course 60% of their retail businesses third-party marketplaces and
the 3PL, the 3PL.
Yeah,
business.
So there would be a lot of exposure there, presumably on imported product.
We haven't talked about TikTok recently. It's funny, behind the scenes, is we've talked about TikTok 3 times and then edited it out because we're not sure. Every deadline that comes up, we're like, well, let's take it out because we think it's going to get kicked down the can, or the can will get kicked down the road, which is basically one of your predictions. Well, sure enough, it got another 75-day extension. Right. It's hard in my mind to see China at this point giving up on TikTok and the algorithm, or maybe it's a trade. Maybe it's a negotiating point, but it's hard to see. What do you think's going on? And let's talk about it for a minute. I guess it's pretty important to retailers.
Yeah, growing importance. Though we did see some news that TikTok's been pruning back some of its staffing for their U.S. e-commerce business because apparently, and I don't know if this is some sort of like pushback on consumers seeing it as a U.S. consumers seeing it as a Chinese company and maybe being a little less interested in buying. But anyway, they haven't met some of their numbers, so they're cutting some costs. But yeah, every week it seems like, oh, maybe a deal's about to happen. And right before last week's episode, I think Trump was talking about, apparently Amazon was in the bidding and they had, a bunch of bids and it looked like a deal might be imminent. Yeah. And then, of course, the trade escalation started. And I guess, China basically said, well, we're not talking about this right now. So I definitely would be very surprised to see a deal happen in the next few weeks, just given the state of the U.S.-China relations, whether we'll be, cooler heads will prevail in a couple months' time as we get close to this ban, whether it's going to get extended.
I think it's going to be in your predictions next year. Basically, it's going to get kicked down.
Carryover prediction.
2026 carryover prediction is where I think it's going to wind up. Let's shift gears a little bit. And let's talk about some interesting developments in the luxury market.
Yeah, we had a couple things, a couple pieces of news, as well as something we just wanted to talk about that you and I experienced a couple of weeks back. Sanford Bernstein, a big research group, came out with a prediction that the luxury market, a revised prediction, because they originally were predicting that the luxury market was going to be up this year. They are now predicting it's going to shrink by 2%. Of course, this has to do with all the turmoil in the market. We've been talking about most of this episode. That has definitely some ripple effects. One thing we'll talk about. But a piece of interesting news, not totally unexpected. Prada Group is going to be buying Versace for $1.4 billion from accessible luxury company Capri Holdings. So this has been talked about for a while. Capri had said they were trying to unload Versace. Prada, while much, much smaller than Kering and LVMH, is now kind of growing its portfolio. So adding Versace to the main Prada brand and Miu Miu, which has been doing quite well. And Capri has indicated that, this is going to allow them to focus on their primary brands that they're retaining, which would be Jimmy Choo and Michael Kors in particular. And they did say that they are going to be launching Michael Kors on Amazon, which is an interesting move in terms of luxury brands generally not wanting to partner with Amazon. And they are also going to be making the price points even more accessible. So Capri's really been in quite a bit of turmoil with the failed Tapestry merger and all this kind of stuff. So that will be interesting to watch. And then the thing that I thought we'd just talk about quickly. So I wrote a post a few weeks back now on Forbes about whether the Saks and Neiman's merger was already in trouble. That largely had to do with what we were learning, and I think we've talked about maybe once or twice on the podcast, of the vendor payment issues. So Saks Global, the new company headed by Mark Metrick, indicated that they were going to go from 30-day terms to 90-day terms, which vendors didn't like, but they also weren't going to get current on some of their outstanding vendor payments until a year from July. So if you're interested in that, there's plenty of news out there about exactly how that works. But anyway, it caused quite a bit of uproar and has caused a number of vendors to either stop shipping to Saks or be more parsimonious, I guess you could say, in their shipments. So you and I were in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago. We got a chance to visit the Saks Fifth Avenue store and the Neiman Marcus store in the Fashion Show Mall. You can see videos of these two store visits on our YouTube channel. So go check those out. And I'll be posting, by the time you hear this, they'll already both be posted on LinkedIn as well. But, what we could really see there, particularly in the Saks Fifth Avenue store, is the effect of non-shipment, because the store was quite empty. There just wasn't that much to buy, which is probably particularly hard in a market in Las Vegas where people might come in and want to wear something that day. But I think we are aware of these issues really across the chain. So when you layer on top of the potential slowdown in the market more broadly, when you layer on top the tariff impact, since so much of the product that is sold in these stores comes from Europe and a fair amount of it is made in Asia. And with the gyrations in the stock market, my experience from working at Neiman Marcus is that the luxury market is much more affected by asset value. So when the stock market is hot, luxury tends to do better. So, that impact could be quite significant. So I think that gets back a little bit to why Bernstein is suggesting the luxury market can contract. But again, remember that a lot of the growth in luxury is happening with the vendor-owned stores, not so much the department stores. So my expectation, I don't think Bernstein predicted the impact on Saks and Neiman's, but I would assume this means the Saks and Neiman's business, even absent the inventory issues, is likely to be down significantly. So when you layer this all together, you really wonder how strong this operation is going to be, and probably things are likely to get worse, particularly if you don't have product to sell. So, they just don't have the cash. Saks Global just doesn't have.
They don't have the cards.
The cash.
They don't have the cards.
Anyway, but we'll wrap up with one piece of good news. I know we're going long here on the news segment, but one piece of good news: a couple of weeks back, the Neiman Marcus store here in Dallas, where I live, the so-called, many people think of it as the original store. Technically, it's not the original store. It was a smaller store that burned down 100 years ago or whatever it is now. Saks was planning to close that. They have now gotten a lifeline. They're going to stay open at least through the holiday while a group figures out what they're going to do with that real estate. And there's a whole lot of challenges there that maybe we'll get into at a later date. But in any event, an uprising of community leaders and customers and all sorts of stuff worked with Saks Global to extend the store's lifeline by at least another 8 months, I guess, at this point. So stay tuned. Watch this space.
All right. It's a great way to wrap the news. It's funny, another behind-the-scenes comment for our listeners. At the beginning of the season, you and I said, let's see if we can get the news done in 10 to 15 minutes max. Because, what could be happening? It's quiet. Like, what could... So if you're a longtime listener, our news segment, ebbs and flows, but has been getting a little longer. When there's news, we talk about it, and it's pretty important stuff. So there's a lot going on. So hopefully everybody appreciates it. All right, let's get to our segment, you and me together, talking about 5-year retrospective, but also forward looking on remarkable retail. All right, we're back, and we are celebrating and looking back on 5 years. Can you imagine, Steve? It's been 5 years since you published Remarkable Retail, which means a couple of years even before that when you were writing it, and even longer before you conceived it. And as a reminder, so to speak, to everybody, there was a second edition that you published pretty quickly, which kind of tried to capture COVID impacts, which we'll talk about as well. We've talked about this before, but, when I talk to authors, there's the kind of many reasons or impetuses why they write the book. Some are just watching events and saying, I have something to say. Others it's been working my entire career, and I've noticed that I have this perspective that I want to share. What was your impetus for writing Remarkable Retail?
Well, of course, my dream was that it would turn into a Hallmark holiday series, but sadly, very sadly.
Not yet. It takes 10 years.
Right, I know. No, there's still, I've got my agent working feverishly on it as we speak. Well, part of it was I was just interested in writing a book, and I had to figure out what it was going to be about. But I would say it really goes back to when I first started talking about one of our favorite terms here, the bifurcation in retail, because I started to notice this actually a little bit, some of the work I was doing at Neiman Marcus 16, 17 years ago, where I was noticing just how much growth there was in the high end of retail. But of course, I wasn't paying that much attention to the low end. But when I went off on my own as a consultant and I started writing blog pieces and then eventually started doing speaking and writing for Forbes, the collapse of the middle was something that I really saw. But I was trying to understand, why did so many companies that were once doing very, very well start to fall on hard times? And a lot of it really had to do with the environment had changed so much that what was once special started to become increasingly boring, mediocre, uninteresting, however you want to describe it. And because of my long relationship with Seth Godin and his kind of whole purple cow remarkability kind of thing, I started to think about, well, how might I take some of those ideas and try to put them in the context for what had been happening at retail, but what was happening. And that's where I got this idea to, kind of wrap that up as this concept of remarkable retail. So I was speaking about it starting probably 8-9 years ago and evolving it and writing individual pieces. And then I was like, oh, maybe I've got a book here. So obviously that happened. Timing wise, just to talk quickly about the second edition, I finished writing the first edition of Remarkable Retail basically in November of 2019, and it came out April 14th of 2020. And, there was a lot going on in March and April, as it turned out. So I did not have a global pandemic.
Not the tour you imagined. How do you feel about the impact of the book? I mean, you put this thing out into the universe, these great insights, and we continue to talk about it, of course, on the podcast. It really was the impetus for this podcast. But how are you feeling 5 years on? Do you think, do you think it was well received? Do you think it made an impact? Did it achieve the objectives that you kind of set out in your own mind?
I'd say mostly. I think every author wishes the book had sold better or had more long-lasting impact. It's a very hard thing to accomplish. I mean, the book continues to sell pretty well 5 years on, which is not that common. It's got, 4.7, 4.8 rating on Amazon. It's probably the best-selling retail strategy book globally of the past decade. So that's pretty good. The thing that sort of gnaws at me to a certain degree, and there's no way to say this without sounding less than humble, but some of the things that I was really pushing in my speaking and writing, and I very much speak about in the book, people seem to now just be appreciating. And so it's frustrating to me that I see people are like, had you read the book on and acted on it, you'd be 4 or 5 years ahead. So that's a very selfish
you do make some of those comments on LinkedIn. He said, yeah, I wrote about that 5 years ago.
Right.
It's the whole unified commerce. Well, that goes back 20 years in our careers.
But, that's a very egotistical, selfish way of looking at it. But, to the extent, I didn't write the book, for fame and fortune so much, right? I wrote the book primarily to try to make an impact in the retail industry. And it certainly had some impact. But, when I see some companies that have struggled, it's, I would have liked to think that I could have perhaps contributed to that in some way.
The centerpiece of the book, the 8 Essential Framework, as you kind of reflect on that 6 years later, are there elements of that you would update today, that you would say, well, that's beyond just being essential, that's now more table stakes, completely table stakes? I mean, I remember we discussed it about that some were more table stakey, so to speak, than others. Some are really true differentiators. How are you, take us through the 8 essentials real quickly in case anyone hasn't seen it or might have forgotten, and how you're thinking about it today.
Sure. So I'll do this real quickly. So the 8 essentials, the first is digitally enabled. And so one of the things I try to get at there is a lot of companies talk about being digital first. And I think there's lots of cases where that way of thinking gets you to not a great place, because there's lots of customer journeys and branding elements that are more analog first. So it's really about being, tech driven, but ultimately really the second one, which is being human centered, really deeply understanding potential customers and current customers as humans, and really being able to understand both their rational motivations as well as their more emotional aspects. And absolutely that can be driven by technology, but kind of being exclusively technology focused, I think, or digitally focused is limiting. The third is harmonized, which is really my word for omni-channel or unified. But the reason in particular I like harmonized so much, and really this idea of making the customer the channel, is you're trying to get all elements, or as many elements of the customer experience, digital or physical, to work together in harmony. So, not to play out a music analogy too much, but, it's resolving the discordant notes in the customer experience, but also amplifying those that really give you something special. So I think frictionless is a little anodyne in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I think that's an element of it, but this harmonized experience, I think, is really important. The fourth is mobile. One of what things that was going on then, and I think by now probably is very, very well understood, is that when we start to talk about digital, a lot of times we're talking about mobile because smart devices are so pervasive. So many shopping journeys now, one way or another, involve a mobile touch point. So I was really trying to lift that up because that was changing very quickly and becoming much more important. Personal or personalized, how do we really get closer to being intensely customer relevant, ideally at a more one-to-one level, but getting closer to that. The last, or not the last one, but the next one is connected. And again, I think this is something that's a little less interesting now, but just, to the degree that social media was becoming more and more important, TikTok was starting to emerge, lots of business models that were based upon marrying supply and demand. So models like Uber, Airbnb, at that time I wrote the book, they were certainly there, but becoming much more important. And as we sit here today, obviously they're hugely important. And then I get to the last two. So you talked about table stakes versus differentiators. The way I thought about it in the book at that time was that the first six I just mentioned were very much table stakes. In other words, if you weren't pretty proficient at them, you were likely at a competitive disadvantage. 7 and 8, memorable and radical, were really more differentiators. So memorable is kind of at the heart of being remarkable. How do you create something or a set of things so unique, differentiated, and powerful that they really give you a huge edge, make you truly remarkable as a business. And radical was really taking more risk, innovating, pushing the frontier, aiming higher in the value, deliver, moving faster. Some of the things, frankly, I really unpack more in my latest book, Leaders Leap. So, when I look back at them, I say, for the most part, they're still relevant. I just think, as I was alluding in my earlier comments, mobile now, I think most companies really get this, and that's not nearly as important. Connected, similarly, I think everybody has a pretty good appreciation for that. So I don't think that's
inflicted upon us in some ways. Right?
Yeah. So, if I had to do it, you didn't exactly answer this, but if I were doing it all over again, refreshing the framework, I might have six of the 8 still there. I don't know. I hadn't thought too deeply about whether there's a new one to add. I really do think, though, and part of the reason why I wrote Leaders Leap is that need to be memorable, to amplify the wow, to really, really rise above the rest in terms of the customer value you deliver, is only getting more and more important. And we can see plenty of companies that continue to get into trouble that don't do it. And then that need to innovate, to move faster, to experiment more, which is really kind of embedded, take more risks. The idea that safe is risky, that's really embedded in radical.
Speaking of radical, if there's one of the essentials I think has been, I don't want to say distorted, but sometimes misinterpreted, it's radical. Because we talked about this a couple of episodes ago in the context of what the Trump administration is doing. And you made the point there's a difference between being radical and being reckless. Because radical can have, there's a spectrum of being radical. It's like, hey, I'm going to do something wild. I'm going to close every single store I got, or I'm going to go to EDLP. Talk about that for a little bit, because I feel like that's the one element that to me is open to interpretation. It's a little subjective than objective, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think if I had to do it all over again, I might have either used a different word, though I'm not sure which one I would use, and maybe explained it a little bit better than I did. I did get a chance to do a bit of a do-over on that topic in Leaders Leap, even though Leaders Leap's not specifically a retail book, as you know. I was deliberately trying to be provocative because what I saw at the time, and I would say I still largely see, is too much conservatism in the part on the part of retailers, and particularly the ones that are struggling. And so, this whole idea, which I get into in the book quite a lot, of the defenders of the status quo, or the Department of No, as Sucharita Kodali, who wrote the foreword for the second edition, talks about. So I was deliberately trying to poke people in the eye a little bit and say, let's go from caretaker management to fundamentally taking on more risk. But yes, you have to be very careful not to engage in moonshots or really ill thought out plans. Like, that's not what it's about. But ultimately, and I certainly didn't come up with this term. The thing that has been missing so much in most of retail for the past 20 years is this notion of disrupting yourself. So I'll just use one example of where, if you look at Dick's Sporting Goods, they've been disrupting themselves in a way in parallel to rolling out and continuing to support their kind of core category killer type model that they've had for, it's evolved, but it's been more or less similar kind of model for 10 or 15 years. But by doing these house of sport concepts, which aren't radically different than their core model, but different enough. I think, if they look, I assume, I did work with Dick's a little bit a number of years ago, but not recently. If they looked at their vulnerability and they looked at ways to really become more memorable, creating something that might actually replace, and this is actually starting to happen in some instances where they're actually closing the old concept in favor of this new model. And you kind of wonder, had department stores done that 10, 15, 20 years ago, when I say, kind of moving from Earth 1 to Earth 2. So it's deliberately provocative, but yes, I have to be careful to kind of caveat it that people don't get the wrong impression that it's moonshots and reckless behavior.
One of the favorite parts of both your books is the quotes, and I know you put a lot of thought into these quotes, and one of my favorite is the future will not be evenly distributed, not just because William Gibson was Canadian, but he says the future.
So it helps.
But it helps. I don't think I've slipped in a Canadian reference in the past 10 minutes. Anyway, so the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about in the episode about, these, call it bifurcated as well, that powerful, big get bigger. They've got such advantage, and it's getting harder and harder to catch up, right, with the Walmarts of the world. And they just continue to press their advantage, and it continues to be bifurcated. Right. Do you see that? I mean, I think sometimes that, when you think of e-commerce, for example, you had Shopify, which was a leveling of the playing field kind of technology, right? Anybody could now suddenly be in e-commerce. Are you thinking about, we haven't said AI, I don't think, in this entire episode yet. So are you thinking about a technology like AI that can be that, okay, you might get an advantage being bigger, but everybody can get an advantage, and it's a bit of a leveling of the playing field kind of technology in the context of thinking about how that we all compete with each other, all retailers compete with each other?
Well, I guess it gets back a little bit to, the idea of understanding things that you need to do to be at parity versus things that can give you an advantage. And when everybody, like electricity, like deciding to use electricity, right? At one point, there were people that could take advantage of that, right? But now nobody talks about having access to electricity the internet or any of these kinds of things. So I think you have to be really careful to understand it gets back to the table stakes versus differentiator kind of thing. And not, one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of innovating to parity. So many companies spend a lot of time working on stuff and then just discover that they've just caught up and now they're behind on something else. Mm-hmm. But the reason why I like it, there's two reasons I think I like that quotation. One is, again, it gets to this idea is looking at things kind of on average can be very unhelpful, right? So if the future is happening someplace, you may want to pay attention to it, even if it's not affecting you yet.
Right.
The other thing I think is, which I talk more about in Leaders Leap, is this idea, borrowing from a great Canadian, Joe Jackman's idea of seek insight everywhere. Like your future is being determined by things that are happening somewhere in the world. It may be happening in a different country. It may be happening in a Stanford lab. It may be happening in the hospitality industry, hasn't yet made it to retail, because new ideas get transferred very quickly, and you're only as good as your customer's last great experience. So that means that you have to really be opening the aperture and paying attention to a lot more things, because the world just changes much more quickly. A new technology that emerged 25 years ago, in many cases you wouldn't even know about it, right? Because of the world wasn't so flat, right?
Yeah.
But now, somebody will put something on social media and it could blow up. So I think it just, at the risk of stating the obvious, the future's happening faster and faster all the time. So it's not only not evenly distributed, but the chance that something that can kind of come out of left field, relatively speaking.
Hello, DeepSeek.
Well, DeepSeek, Temu Sheehan, generative AI, for, there's a number of things that really most people weren't paying, even going back to what I said about I missed, retail media networks. I mean, you could argue that I should have been paying more attention to that, but for whatever reason I wasn't.
Nobody else was. I mean, very few people were, other than
probably,
Amazon.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to beat myself up about it, but it's just an example of something, even though I do this full time for a living and like to think I'm paying attention to emerging trends, I missed it. And then, a year later, it was starting to become a thing. And now today it's a huge thing, right? And so, that's really just in 3 or 4 years. And I know we've got an episode coming up where we're going to get into that in a lot.
Couple episodes.
So, it just puts a real premium on paying more attention, being more creative, and then being able to position yourself to be agile enough to respond.
Let's wrap with this question. If you had to do a third edition of the book, I mean, you and I have talked about both on mic and off mic that I'm not sure we still understand the impacts, the long consumer and industry impacts of the COVID era, for example. If you were to do a third edition of Remarkable Retail, what would your thoughts be? Where would you take it?
Two things come to mind. I mentioned a little bit earlier, maybe it's 6 essentials, not 8 or whatever. I haven't thought too deeply about that. One thing that I try to do a little bit more on in Leaders Leap is get into the leadership challenges rather than just like prescription of, look at these essentials and apply them to your business. I wouldn't necessarily make it less prescriptive in that regard, but I would probably dial up the leadership aspects of it. And obviously there's a lot of change management and cultural sort of issues if we're really going to drive, particularly the essential number 8, the radical change. So I kind of shorthanded that a bit. And as I've been doing consulting on it or speaking about it, I've been able to add some of that in kind of in real life or in my speaking. But the thing that I am really interested in maybe a different book, rather than, because I'm not going to do a third edition unless somebody throws a lot of money at me. So if you're listening, call me. But
have a lot of money.
I think I would go in a different direction because I'm really interested in more the humanity, the human centered kind of piece, because I think that retail is risking being less soulful, if I could use that term. So technology driven, which is hugely important. I'm not suggesting that that's going to slow down and it's not hugely important. But when you look at the brands that are the most valuable, that's bifurcated as well, right? You've got the Costco, Amazon, Walmart, which have little soul in them, right? It's all about functional, or not all about, but largely about functional benefits. But the other two most valuable retailers on the planet are Apple and LVMH. That's not about, many people criticize Apple for how inconvenient it is and how much friction there is in dealing with that brand, right? But they activate our lives in really different ways. It's much more about storytelling and emotion. And I think there's a real danger that many brands are losing that, because as they kind of get into a race to the bottom, one, they're not going to win a race to the bottom, but secondly, it starts to be about self-checkout and robots and chatbots and all that kind of stuff. And again, I'm not suggesting that those aren't worthwhile and there aren't huge benefits. But again, you can risk being in the middle because you chase the tech and take the people out of it. So this is why we hear people complaining about not being able to get a salesperson, or not having that experiential part that can be a differentiator. So I don't know where I'm going to go with that necessarily, but I think by putting humans centered as just one of the 8 essentials, I might have underplayed that dimension as things that I think not the more functional brand should be thinking about, but the more special, not big, specialty, emotional type of brand should be thinking about.
It's interesting as you reflect on, you're not going to do, as you say, a third edition, but really this podcast serves as a kind of an ongoing dialogue about the latest thinking, right? So it really is a dynamic version. We're going to be celebrating our anniversary in the fall for the pod, which started out as a focus on the book, but really has added a very dynamic element, I thought, to your writing, right? It allows you to kind of articulate on a day-to-day basis without having to put it down in paper, kind of reflecting on that framework. So I think both work too well. I think they both work well in concert. Yeah,
it does, and it's actually one of the reasons. Not to get into the inside baseball here, but I think one of the reasons why many niche type books don't do as well anymore is because we have other mediums to, whether it's a Substack or YouTube channel or podcasts, as well as obviously when I do workshops or consulting or executive coaching or these kinds of things, and I get a chance to give my latest and greatest thinking on it. So I think, the ability to get information and spread ideas more in bite-sized pieces rather than having to do it in a book. That's just, the world has changed, I think, in terms of the way people consume information, which is great because it does allow, because the down, as I said at the beginning or earlier, the downside of a book is you put it out and it's a thing that lives forever. So if I had said something really stupid, somebody go back and say, oh, well, you wrote this. And like, well, okay, well, at the time it seemed like a good thing. And maybe I got it wrong and I'll own up to that. Or maybe just, unexpected things happen that I couldn't have foreseen. But regardless, people are hopefully starting from where they are, not, from some idea. I like to think a lot of these ideas have held up pretty well for multiple years, but at the same time, nothing that anybody has said 4 or 5 years ago is probably going to stand the test of time.
Well, I think it provides such a great foundation, and it still provides a touchstone for example, who we interview, right? We want them to be remarkable. We want them to be in the framework. We want to learn a lesson that is anchored in the key lessons and thinking behind your book. So, again, a little bit of inside baseball, but it does provide us a framework. Let's leave it there, and we'll be back to our regular scheduled programming next week. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 10 are available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell all your friends in the retail industry all about us. And make sure and visit our newly refreshed YouTube channel for exclusive video and our new virtual store tours. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.